Today's headline is a thrilling war story, In Defense of the Enemy. The subheadline says, Blue and Gray in the Same Line of Battle, Black Flags of the Confederacy, by T.J. Mackey, Captain Engineers of the Confederate States of America. It says, among heroic deeds of our late Civil War, heretofore unrecorded, none is more worthy of historic notice than the conduct of Lieutenant James W. Graves of the 3rd Missouri Mounted Infantry of the Confederate States of America, in risking his life in defense of Union prisoners under his escort. To appreciate the emergency that Lieutenant Graves was called upon to face, it's necessary to understand the military situation in Missouri during the year 1864. Bands of armed guerrillas, commanded by Quantrill, Anderson, Todd, Holtzclaw, and others, traversed the state and harried the homes of thousands of its people with fire and sword. The excesses committed by those leaders, all bearing commissions duly signed by the President of the Confederate States, surpass in atrocity the deeds perpetrated by savages in our Indian wars. Captain Park, commanding a company of the 4th Missouri Cavalry, thus reports the result of an attack made upon him by a band led by Anderson and Holtzclaw at Rocheport on August 26, 1864. My men who fell into their hands were most barbarously massacred, 4 being scalped, 1 hung and scalped, and 3 had their throats cut. General W.S. Rosecrans of the United States of America, in his report of operations in Missouri, says, on the 1st of September, 1864, Anderson's band attacked a train on the Northern Missouri Railroad, took from it 22 unarmed soldiers, many on sick leave, and after robbing, placed them in a row and shot them to death. Some of the bodies they scalped and put others across the track and ran the engine over them. On September 27th, this band, with numbers swollen to 300 or 400, attacked Major Albert V. Johnston, commanding 130 men of the 39th Missouri Volunteers near Centralia, and shot every man of them in cold blood. The Order of American Knights. The men who composed these bands were members of the Order of American Knights, so called, a secret treasonable organization hostile to the state and the United States that had an enrolled membership of 30,000 in Missouri under the leadership of one John H. Taylor, who was designated their supreme head. It was a part of their policy to have every member take the oath of allegiance to the United States and to have themselves enrolled generally into the active militia, in order that they might avert the suspicion of the authorities and at the same time procure arms and ammunition. As militiamen, they cooperated with the guerrillas, giving them information of projected military movements and frequently joining them after shooting down their loyal officers and surrendering at the first opportunity. The entry of General Price's army into Missouri in the early autumn of 1864 greatly stimulated the sanguinary operations of these red-handed moss troopers, for they used his encampment as their base of operations, and when hard-pressed, sought refuge in it. On becoming aware of this practice, General Rosecrans protested against it in a letter to General Price, from which I quote as follows: Permit me, General, to express my surprise and regret that you have allowed to associate with your troops bands of Missouri guerrillas without feeling or principle of nationality, whose record is stained with crimes at which humanity shudders. It's unnecessary to enumerate what these crimes are. The newspapers have not exaggerated. You and I have tried to conduct this war in accordance with the highest dictates of humanity and the laws of war among civilized nations, and I hope the future will make no change in this respect. I am able to state advisedly, as the Chief Engineer of the Missouri Expeditionary Force and a member of General Price's staff, that 2 weeks prior to the receipt of that protest, he issued an order prohibiting any of these predatory bands from entering his lines. Notwithstanding that order, they were harbored in the encampment of General Shelby, one of our division commanders, until the extraordinary incident that I'm about to relate led to their being treated as mere outlaws by all our troops. On October 15, 1864, the federal garrison at Glasgow, Missouri, after a gallant resistance of several hours, surrendered to one of our brigades, commanded by General John B. Clark. General Shelby had cooperated in the attack with his artillery from the opposite side of the Missouri River, where his division was posted, but the actual fighting at the entrenchments and in the town was done by Clark's brigade. The force that surrendered consisted of the 43rd Missouri Infantry and 17th Illinois Cavalry, constituting the garrison commanded by Colonel Chester Harding, Jr., a brave and skillful soldier. It was stipulated in the terms of surrender that the federal officers and enlisted men should be immediately paroled and permitted to return to their homes, there to remain until duly exchanged. It transpired after the surrender that General Rosecrans, the department commander, had announced that he would not recognize paroles as binding upon any of his officers captured by us unless we delivered such officers at one of his military posts to be there certified as paroled. Bloody Bill Anderson's gang. Hence, on the day after the surrender, Colonel Harding and the officers of his command, numbering 28 in all, were started for Boonville, about 30 miles south of Glasgow, that being the nearest federal post. Their escort consisted of Company H, 3rd Missouri Mounted Infantry, numbering 49 rank and file, under the command of Lieutenant James W. Graves. Lieutenant Graves had taken the precaution to throw out flankers and an advance guard of 2 or 3 men while on the march. About 10 miles from Boonville, the sergeant in command of the advance guard reported that there was a body of 100 or more seemingly federal cavalry halted at the forks of the road a half-mile ahead, that they all wore federal uniforms, but that he had approached and reconnoitered them through his field glass and discovered that they were Bloody Bill Anderson's gang of guerrillas. The lieutenant at once formed his command in line of battle and stated to them that when they left Glasgow, Anderson and his band were in Shelby's camp and had no doubt followed them to take the prisoners from the escort and murder and rob them. He added, "Men, you are Confederate soldiers. Anderson and his gang are but robbers and cutthroats who dishonor our colors. I have served in the ranks with you for 3 years, and I need not ask if you will do your duty." The orderly sergeant answered, "Lieutenant, you can bet your life on the men. They will stand by you and defend the prisoners to the death." The whole company responded, "Ay, to the death." Turning to the federal officers, Graves said, "Gentlemen, you have heard my statement and understand the emergency that we are about to face if I do not mistake the purpose of the miscreants in my front. I shall advance at all hazards, but do not feel warranted in taking you under fire without your free consent. You need not consider yourselves prisoners any longer, should you wish to retire and make the effort to reach Boonville by another road. I have 12 extra rifles in the wagons, with plenty of ammunition, that I brought along expecting to secure some recruits before rejoining my command. You can have them, and I can supply you also with 10 .44 caliber revolvers." The blue and the gray resolved to stand together. They answered with one accord that they would stand by him and consider themselves for the occasion not as prisoners, but as American soldiers, and the Confederates as comrades in arms. Colonel Harding stated that those who could be armed would take position in line, and the others could render good service by acting as horse holders. All this occupied but a minute or two, and while the arms were being distributed among the federal officers, 4 men were seen advancing up the road, one of them carrying a white flag. Lieutenant Graves rode out to meet them, accompanied by 6 of his soldiers. When they came within 4 or 5 yards, they halted, and he said to the bearer of the flag, "Who are you, and what do you want?" The answer was, "We belong to Colonel Anderson's cavalry. We want those Yankee officers you've got along with you. They're the ones that butchered some of our men at Palmyra. They belong to McNeil's brigade, and Colonel Anderson says if you refuse to give them up, he'll take them anyhow. He has 300 men with him, and you can save trouble by giving up the Yanks. They're our meat, and we're going to have them dead sure." Lieutenant Graves replied, "Tell Bill Anderson that his damnable proposal is too infamous for me to consider for an instant. We are Confederate soldiers, and he and his men are murderers and thieves. Tell him that if he does not get away from my line of march and clear out with his gang of cutthroats in 5 minutes, I will open fire upon him. Now be off quick, and not another word from you. You deserve to be hanged for bringing such a proposition." On returning to his command, the lieutenant repeated the message that he had received from the guerrilla leader and the answer that he had returned. He found that the 22 federal officers who were armed had formed on the left of the line, and he requested them to take the center, saying, "Gentlemen, I desire for you to be where we can guard both your flanks." One of them, a captain, had preserved his company flag by secreting it under his overcoat at the time of the surrender, and holding it in his hand, he said, "Lieutenant, with your leave, I will add to the gaiety of the occasion by hoisting this flag on our part of the Allied line." Consent was freely given, and the flag, attached to an improvised staff, waved side by side with the Confederate battle flag, a red St. Andrew's cross on a blue field. The company dismounted and formed in one rank, advanced through the open wood, while 4 mounted men were ordered to ride along the road and observe the movements of the enemy. They were instructed that if they found Anderson's gang advancing, they should fall back without firing and report, and that to avoid falling into an ambuscade, they should proceed in single file at the distance of about 50 yards apart. It was indeed an extraordinary command, a Confederate federal company, composed of veterans of both great armies. Nothing could have been more incongruous, tested by the laws of war, and yet nothing was more natural than the spectacle of American soldiers in the same line of battle advancing against the common enemy. It was a happy augury of the coming of this present time, when all true Americans render homage to the one flag of their common country, and will be henceforth in peace friends, and in war brothers in arms. The horse holders moved with the 2 baggage wagons about 100 yards to the right and rear of the advancing line. At least one half of Lieutenant Graves' men were armed with Winchester repeating rifles, while all the others in line had the improved Springfield breechloader, except 10 of the federal contingent who were provided with Colt's Army revolvers, which had an effective range of 150 yards. The outlaws in their front numbered, as subsequently ascertained, 165, but the disparity in numbers was more than equalized by the superior quality of the soldiers opposed to them. The officers of the 43rd Missouri Infantry had served in many campaigns with distinction, and were all brave men, while the Confederates of the 3rd Missouri had won laurels in numerous battles on both sides of the Mississippi. Buddy Bill's gang loses courage. They moved on the right of the Boonville Road, which they had trenched to the east, so that marching south, they soon reached it at the point where the guerrillas were first reported to be in position. They were nowhere in sight, however, and the scouts had also passed on. The company still pursued its march through the belt of woods that skirted the road for a mile further, when it was met by one of the scouts, who reported that Anderson's band, after following the road to Boonville for 2 miles, had turned to the left and gone off to the west. As it was near nightfall when they resumed their march upon the main road, it was decided to encamp, and a strong position was selected for that purpose, with easily guarded approaches. A double line of sentinels was posted, the federal officers requesting that they too should be detailed for guard duty. The next morning, the distinctive colors of the blended forces were furled up, and the normal situation being restored, they marched under the white flag. When within 2 miles of Boonville, they were met by 2 companies of federal cavalry that were marching to succor them, the commander of the garrison having been informed that they were surrounded by Anderson's guerrillas. Lieutenant Graves and his company there received a most kindly and generous welcome, mingled with much good cheer, as no hands clasped so warmly as those that have dropped the sword. A prisoner of war hanged. I esteemed it a fortunate circumstance for our army that the chivalrous conduct of a Confederate officer in his command should have been so heartily recognized at Boonville, for our entry into that town on the 9th day of that month was signalized by an act of barbarity that added a new horror to the annals of civilized warfare. On that day, our advance brigade, commanded by General Joseph O. Shelby, entered the town and assaulted an earthwork garrison by 250 enrolled militia under the command of Captain F. Shoemaker. The column of attack was gallantly met and repulsed, suffering severe loss. Shelby then sent in a flag and demanded the surrender of the garrison, offering honorable terms, and at the same time stating that his artillery would soon be up, and that he would then reduce the fort, but in that event he would give no quarter. Captain Shoemaker surrendered, relying upon the written guarantee that he and his men would be treated as prisoners of war and promptly paroled. On that night, he was delivered up by the Provost Guard on the demand of a number of officers and soldiers of Shelby's brigade and hanged to the limb of a tree. General Shelby, in an official report, disclaimed having authorized the murder, yet gave it his sanction by declaring that the betrayed victim of the horrible crime richly deserved death. I can state, after a thorough investigation, that Captain Shoemaker's record was that of a true gentleman and a brave and stainless soldier. The unspeakable treachery that visited upon him such an undeserved fate aided to stamp General Shelby as the chief of the Black Flags of the Confederacy. By merit raised to that bad eminence, Lieutenant Graves' humane and fearless defense of the prisoners committed to his charge served to convince the people of that war-stricken section that General Price's army did not consist of a horde of brutal savages. Lieutenant Graves, on his northward march to rejoin his regiment, which he reached a few days later, halted at Lexington, We received the thanks of General Rosecrans, who made him the bearer of the letter to General Price, from which I have quoted. Within a week after Anderson's barbarous and audacious demand that the federal prisoners should be turned over to him to be murdered, his band was routed in Ray County, and he himself was killed by the 33rd Regiment of Missouri State Troops, commanded by Colonel S.P. Cox. I should add that the federal officers who owed their lives to Lieutenant Graves' noble discharge of his duty sought years after the war to ascertain his whereabouts, that they might bestow upon him some suitable token of their gratitude. He had removed with his family to the western border of Texas, and their inquiries through their local papers failed to meet his eye until last year. A correspondence resulted in his meeting them at St. Louis, where they presented him with a massive gold medal, bearing upon one of its faces two clasped hands beneath the flag of the Union, and on the other an inscription referring to the event that the medal was designed to commemorate. This story comes from the great state of New York, being reported in the Sun of September 2nd, 1894. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.